Today I have back on the show Dr. Peter Salerno. He is the author of The Nature and Nurture of Narcissism, and today we went over his new book, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance. We talked about the difference between traumatic cognitive dissonance and PTSD and CPTSD, the red flags of a therapist who doesn't understand narcissism, why going no contact alone isn't enough to heal the trauma bond, toxic masculinity, and we even went over if there is a spiritual component of narcissism. Are they possessed by some kind of dark entities? We go over that later in the interview. But with that, I hope you enjoy my discussion with Dr. Salerno as much as I did. Dr. Peter Salerno, how are you today, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you, sir?
Doing very well. Thank you again for joining me. I can't wait to talk to you about your new book here, Traumatic Cognitive Dissonance.
Yeah. Thanks for having me back.
My pleasure. The first question I have for you is, what is the difference between traumatic cognitive dissonance and PTSD and CPTSD for that matter?
So I think the short answer is PTSD doesn't necessarily have to involve anything personal, right? So we've seen people witness events. There's PTSD from natural disasters, accidents, near-death experiences, loss, right? So it's essentially PTSD develops after this acute stress stage, and then there's kind of toxic or chronic stress in the nervous system, and you have these symptoms, but they're pretty standard symptoms. With traumatic cognitive dissonance, and I would even say complex trauma, there's these kind of atypical symptoms that are not necessarily standard trauma symptoms. And they're sort of implanted because there's some sort of manipulation or coercion going on a very personal level. So while it's not personal in the sense that you're causing it and there's something about you that's causing it, it's personal in the sense that the person doing it to you is specifically targeting you in manipulating the bond, the attachment, the trust, and those types of things. And that doesn't necessarily have to take place with more traditional PTSD.
Okay. And you have mentioned this before too, but no contact alone, not enough to heal a trauma bond. Why is that?
Yeah, because trauma bonds are related to stress in the nervous system. And so just distance from the cause of the trauma doesn't necessarily remove the trauma from your nervous system. So our body definitely has, it's kind of, this is in us at a cellular level when we're traumatized. Okay.
Right.
So basically what happens is when you get enough stress in your nervous system, you enter into like a non-recovery mode. And so it doesn't matter how much time passes and it doesn't matter how much distance. I obviously think if you're being abused in this way to where it's causing you trauma, the best thing to do is to go no contact and remove physical proximity. But you're also going to be carrying that trauma with you, in memory, in nervous system responses. So that's like the first step, I would say, but it doesn't necessarily cure the bond because the bond has been forged or, cemented with this intermittent reinforcement. So you're not even necessarily sure that it's the right thing to do to leave. That's one of the problems. That's what keeps people stuck. And so even though you may go no contact, you have to anticipate that there's going to be some physiological symptoms and some dissonance to deal with after.
What are the signs of someone who is in a non-recovery mode? I bet you there's a lot of people in that and they just don't realize it.
Yeah. I'd say some of the indicators would be changes in your core belief system. So believing things about yourself, about others, about the world that are not accurate, but you didn't believe them before the relationship. So you kind of got conditioned in a way or entranced. So your beliefs have actually shifted. I would say that there's people have different nervous system responses. So a common response is to be in like this almost perpetual freeze state where it's not necessarily that you can't function, but you're really operating in a way that's not characteristic of you. And so there's a lot of these confusing, bewildering, like thoughts, ruminating thoughts, this sort of ping pong effect, if you will, not knowing what's true and then kind of knowing what's true, but not being able to settle on one or the other. So there's a lot of confusion associated with something like this. And that keeps you stuck too, because it's like your brain and your nervous system are trying to land on something to just settle. And it just doesn't, you just don't get access to that ability to settle.
Mm. So someone is at this place. They're maybe in non-recovery mode. They're experiencing traumatic cognitive dissonance. What are some of the red flags of a therapist that maybe doesn't understand narcissism?
Yeah, great question. And again, I think a lot of the therapists that, you know, very well meaning, it's not like they're trying to dupe you or not help you, but I think everybody has their specialties and their scope of competence. So what that means is they may not have done, extended education or training to identify something like narcissistic abuse or narcissism. So if you're going to them and they don't have that specialty, what could happen is they're going to try to fit the client and the situation that the client's in into a particular theoretical model that they've been trained in. And so, for example, a lot of these models are sort of they're helpful, but not really with narcissism, because they're like positive psychology models where they're just kind of presuming everybody's the same on the inside. Or it might be a trauma model where it's like, okay, so we can get to the bottom of the way of this person's pathology and stop the abuse by healing their trauma, right? So if you're telling this to a victim and then you put the victim back into the situation and they have these hopes that, oh, maybe we'll get this person cured or healed, that's unrealistic, because there's a lot of evidence that these types of individuals don't respond to those traditional history-oriented collaborative therapy orientations. And so it could actually potentially make a predator worse and put a victim in more danger. And not all therapists are, cut from the same cloth, and they're not supposed to be, but you do need to be careful and assess. If I'm going through something that I'm perceiving is manipulative and abusive, I need to make sure that I do my due diligence to look up what the credentials of the therapist are, because somebody who doesn't have this experience with this type of abuse could potentially inadvertently cause more harm than good.
Right. I mean, what I hear some therapists say, they'll get mad even when they hear the word narcissism. They'll say, oh, narcissism's so rare, or everyone has some narcissistic traits. This whole thing is just a fad. The word's been thrown around too much. Is there anything you would say to the therapists or professionals that say that?
Well, first of all, the prevalence estimates of disorders that collectively involve narcissism, pathological narcissism as a central feature, increases the prevalence in the general population in a very, very big way. So it's not like, we look at NPD and the prevalence estimates are 1%. Well, there's a lot of other personality disorders that have this pathological narcissism as a central feature. So it increases significantly to, between 15 and 19% of the general population. People walking around with a personality disorder, where pathological narcissism could potentially be, a main feature of that presentation. So it's not nearly as rare as people say it is. It's also probably not as blown out of proportion as people say it is. It's probably, in the middle somewhere. But personality disorders have overlapping features. So when we talk about one, we're oftentimes talking about more than one. I don't think maybe a lot of therapists don't look at it that way. They also, I think there's different definitions of narcissism from a clinical perspective. So there is this healthy narcissism that's sort of outgrown throughout the lifespan naturally, but it's not the same narcissism that we're talking about here. It's, it's like kids, for the most part, are egocentric. They don't necessarily have the brain wiring to not be selfish. And then they outgrow that. And they're also hopefully taught and reared in such a way where they learn how to be a little bit less selfless over time. But these are like, this type of narcissism that we're talking about is there's a natural course of outgrowing that, and that's not a problem. The problematic one is the pathological one that persists across the lifespan into adulthood, and it's not the same thing as the narcissism that those therapists might be referring to. And I think there needs to be that distinction. There's sadly a lot of linguistic overlap in psychology, where you use one term and it means something completely different in two contexts. One example of that is we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder and we have obsessive compulsive disorder, completely unrelated. But to somebody who hasn't studied it, it's like they could be the same thing, and they're often used interchangeably. Another example of that is paranoid personality disorder and paranoia don't mean the same thing whatsoever, but it's sort of linguistically convenient for therapists and people who are diagnosing to use that term, but it's not an interchangeable term. So I'm not actually fully aware how many therapists even know those distinctions.
Right. There could be a ton who do not. And there's a woman named Chelsea Brooke Cole. She's an LPC. I think she mentioned in one of her books that if you say 5% of the population of America, that's almost 20 million people.
Right.
And as a low estimate,
Mhm.
you say each one of those 20 million people impacts negatively 5 people throughout their lives. That's 100 million people impacted negatively at that rate of narcissism. So to me, that's a lot of freaking people.
A lot of people.
And to say, oh, it's overplayed, it's emphasized too much, I just don't see it.
No, I don't see it either. I mean, it's not probably not possible that every person who claims there's like a narcissist around the corner, it's possible that that's not 100% accurate. But I would say it's not that they, I mean, they are the crowd. I would say that, I think they're a big part of the crowd. It's not like it's not as rare as these prevalence estimates indicate. And I think, again, people will hear something and they'll go, oh, well, I see that MPD is the prevalence estimate's 1%. Again, that's not the only disorder that this trait, this feature is prominent in. Even though that's the one that it's named after, there's a lot of really closely related disorders that include that feature. So it's not accurate to say that it's rare.
I'm curious your thoughts on this part too. Now, do you think there's people that are on the spectrum of narcissism but don't qualify for full-blown NPD?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And so that's what we have to kind of understand now is we have, from a diagnostic perspective, we have two models that are pretty much used. We have the categorical model, which is the traditional, here's 9 criteria for NPD. You have to meet 5. You have to check 5 off the list. You don't necessarily have to have one that's required, but you have to meet 5 out of the 9, and then we can put a diagnosis of NPD. And it's not that simple. I mean, we definitely have to do some investigative work in the sense of, was this a pervasive enduring pattern across the lifespan, or is this just happening in one context? We have to rule out other conditions like alcohol and traumatic brain injuries. But for the most part, there's these checklist criteria. Useful, not fully efficient, right? Then we have what's called the dimensional model, where we're identifying pathological traits, and then we're quantifying it. So more or less of each of those traits, right? So there's a degree of antagonism in narcissists. And so there's people that are going to go onto the extreme of antagonism, and some that are going to have it come up once in a while, where so they're probably a little bit or a lot bit more functioning without those traits, like interfering and not causing significant impairment, but they could still from time to time display this antagonism. And antagonism includes hostility, manipulation, deceitfulness, manipulativeness. So it's like all those facets under that domain. But it operates on a continuum, just like autism spectrum disorder, just like schizophrenia now is spectrum disorder, because there's degrees of severity, frequency, and intensity. So absolutely, and NPD operates on that continuum from mild to moderate to severe and everywhere in between.
And you reminded me of another good question. What is the social predator's secret playbook?
I would say, I mean, most of that really just revolves around lying and deception of some kind, right? Misrepresenting themselves in some way. So there's lying of omission. There's lying by just misrepresenting the truth, just outright denying something. There's lying through coercion. Obviously, the famous gaslighting term. It's trying to convince somebody of something that's not true, or trying to distort someone's perception so they no longer trust their own judgment. Those are all forms. I think the main component of the playbook, if you will, is there are inconsistencies in the social predator, and they're typically inconsistent because they lie so often. They contradict their own lies because they don't remember which lies they told, or they tell them so often that they start to change them again and again. But I think it really comes down to the intentionality of deceiving people. I mean, that's really what it is. And so there are various forms of lying and manipulation and deception, but it really just comes down to that. It's just this dishonesty, this misrepresenting the truth, distorting reality on purpose.
I gotcha. And it reminds me of the saying, they say lies have an expiration date, but the truth is timeless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's something that would get in their way, I would imagine.
Yeah, because they really do have a lot of what I tell people, and even in my book, I say it's not worth your time to try to become a human lie detector. But what you need to do is you need to become very skilled at recognizing inconsistencies. Cluster B personalities have this tendency to contradict themselves often, right? And so they some of them do it because they're arrogant enough to think that you're not going to remember something that was said, or they're going to be able to dupe you out of remembering what was said. And so they'll kind of contradict themselves sometimes in even the same sentence. Like they can start off saying something and contradict themselves by the end of the statement. It's really important to look for inconsistencies in their story, in their history, in their relationships, and how you're experiencing them. And that's like probably one of the biggest red flags is if they're consistently inconsistent, that's a problem, right? Because that's a trait or a characteristic rather than just something that's happening once in a while incidentally.
Right. I mean, and people in that spot, what I see them mess up a lot is they get hell bent on trying to get that other person to validate their perception of reality or validate the way they see things. And then when it comes to those disordered personalities, it just doesn't go anywhere when you do that. You're just going in that circular conversation.
Right. Yeah, I attended a training to learn how to administer and score the hair psychopathy checklist a few years back. And so we had to watch all these interrogation videos of people interviewing psychopaths that were, they were not necessarily, well, they weren't, some of them were under arrest and some of them were just, being called in for questioning. But oftentimes, the question of like, well, how did you feel? And they go, oh, I felt nothing. And then like later on in the same sentence, they go, I mean, I felt devastated. And it's like really just right there, very clear as day. Now they'll get enraged if you call them out.
Sure.
So they're oftentimes it's not advised that that the person interviewing them say, I thought you just said that you felt nothing. And now that's not really how you talk to people like that, because, then they fly off the handle most of the time. But just being able to notice that, and then you can get to the point where you kind of, with these people, if you get enough experience, you start to see that like you can almost just assume they're lying and you don't even have to fact check it. Like they're going to slip up at some point. And so, but I would say, just as a word of advice, trying to call them out and confront that and say, I know you're lying. You just said this, or I can get the recording to back up and I'll show you where you lied. But none of that's worth it. You don't want to get into those fights with this type of person. It just doesn't.
And that's where it comes down to people believing in themselves and their own perception of reality. You notice that, now believe your eyes when you see that, and now act accordingly. But when people get really hell bent on, no, I need them to validate, I need to hold them accountable. No, the way to hold them accountable is to enforce consequences with your actions, preferably cut them off and get out of there.
Yeah. I tell people you got to learn the language of disorder. You can't, because the language of logic is confronting somebody on something and then them taking accountability for it, admitting to it, and then you repair that rupture and you move on. That's the language of logic. The language of disorder is this person is going to convince you with all the hard evidence you have that that didn't happen. And you can't make sense out of that kind of nonsense. There's no point in trying to persuade or convince them that they need to fess up because they're not interested in solving the problem, right? So, but I also 100% empathize and sympathize with this, like this ardent desire and this insatiable urge to try to get somebody to admit that they cheated or they lied or they weren't where they said they were, or that they were trying to manipulate you. It's just not, it's really not worth the energy because they aren't interested in collaborating in that way. So.
Right. I mean, it's understandable for people to want to do that before they understand what narcissism is all about.
Oh, yeah.
But once they understand, it's like, okay, if you're getting this lingering upset effect, you're dealing with these crazy making conversations, truly understand they are not looking for a solution. They're looking for a reaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're going to give it to them because you're going to have a big reaction. I tell people covert manipulation evokes overt reactions. So somebody who's going to look you square in the eye and not break eye contact and say, no, I didn't say that. When you have it on tape, you can look at your phone. It's going to infuriate you. And you have to know, like, okay, I need to step away from this right now because they're looking for me to blow up so they can say that I yelled and screamed and threw something. And they're going to document that. And that's overt. So theirs isn't. And they're going to win. They're always going to win and come out on top with those. And I don't, again, like you just said, and I don't blame people. I had to learn the hard way that you try to fight over and over and over again to get somebody to admit to something. And it falls upon deaf ears, blind eyes. They don't care. It's not even a pride thing. I think so much is like sometimes these individuals lie, even when it's in their best interest to tell the truth. Like they'd have a less of a consequence if they tell the truth, but they still decide to go down the route of lying or denying. And so right at that point, it's like, it's too primitive to deal with, you know?
Right. In those moments too, I think little sayings, I think, can really help people because in that moment of truth, what are you going to do? What's going to help you to take a step back and respond rather than react and do something that is going to be healthy for you instead of playing their game? Do you have any tips for people that when they're in that make or break moment?
I mean, right there in the moment, I just think that the best thing that you can try to do is minimize any like emotional dysregulation that you're feeling. I think it's really important to step away. If we're not, so we're mainly talking about emotional manipulation here. Say if there's any risk of physical harm, there's nothing you should say. You should just get yourself safe, right? But if we're talking about people who are feeling hell-bent on trying to get someone to fess up or confess to something, and it's dysregulating you because it's so infuriating, I think the best thing to do is just try to feel as indifferent as possible and create space. I wouldn't try to come up with something clever to say or try to even portray yourself as someone who's impervious to it. I think the best thing to do, I mean, there's unavoidable exchanges that are going to take place, especially if there's court proceedings or, that kind of stuff that shared assets and you have to have contact, but there's really no point in trying to come up with something to say. I do tell people say something as brief as possible. So stay brief, focus on one problem at a time. Don't get derailed in a conversation into the past or the future. Just stay here. Redirect them. This is not what we're talking about right now. We're talking about this. Identify a problem, and then like sometimes offering an option, what works better for you right now, because you're surviving these exchanges. You're not going to win them. You're just surviving them.
Right. You reminded me of an expression that I like. It's BIFF: brief, informative, friendly, and firm. Yeah. When you can't go no contact. And I think that can be helpful, just as remembering not to jade, justify, argue, defend, or explain. That can be helpful sometimes in that moment of truth to not get sucked in to their game.
I do think that's probably, I'm glad you brought that up. I think that's one of the most challenging things for people is when they hear the word friendly. How could I be friendly with someone who's doing this to me? Well, it's not for them.
Right.
It's for you. And there needs to be a bit of some, like, I would even say add a little bit of lightheartedness, some irreverence, like some humor. Like you can't get stuck on how wounded you are in those exchanges, because they're going to chew you up and spit you out. You do have to have this friendly demeanor, but it's not even necessarily because they earned that. It's because that keeps you safer. It protects you from getting caught in the drama. So it's always better to err on the side of having like a little bit of, if you can manage it, to have a little bit of sense of humor in those exchanges and just remain light, because everything else is just going to feel very heavy. It's going to feel very strained, you know?
And I hear what people get caught up on is they think, well, if I'm friendly, I'm rewarding them and they're getting away with their bad behavior. And I would say what you just said. No, it's not for them.
Right.
All this, just like practicing Grey Rock, it's for you and protecting your peace, not for them.
You're just meeting them where they're at in their primitive state. And so it's kind of like you kind of, in your mind, you kind of have to shrug your shoulders and roll your eyes and be like, oh my God, this again. and then with your words, you just kind of, okay. Like I've told people, tell them, sometimes it's helpful to say like, I understand your point. We can talk about this, when we're both calm. But in the meantime, whatever, have a nice day. Like you just need to you're not trying to solve anything there except surviving that interaction. That's really what you're trying to do, is get out of it without getting caught in the drama, because they try to hook you into the drama. That's all they're trying to do. They're trying to sustain old problems and create new ones in every exchange.
Right. Yeah, the lack of collaboration. That's huge.
Yeah. And then you leave with that, you mentioned the lingering upset effect. It's almost like these people have this ability to put something in you, so you can't walk away from it unscathed. It's like you're taking that poison with you, and you feel uneasy for a long time. It lingers, and oftentimes that's a counter-transference reaction. That's a term where it's almost like you feel like something got into you. And with disordered personalities, it lingers longer than someone who just like upsets you. And because there's an intentionality in that. It's like they want you to walk away feeling worse than when you came in.
Right. And something I've noticed in my own life, that some of them seem to have a sixth sense for really trying to pick the things that might be a vulnerability of yours and then ruthlessly attacking it in the most cruel way possible. And it hurts the most when there can be a little bit of truth in what they say, but they take that grain of truth and then they exaggerate it and they really try to pull it. And for me, those are the toughest ones to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that these individuals can get to a point where they know you better than you know yourself, and they know what buttons to push. And the reason why you don't know yourself better is because it's not necessary to self-reflect in that way. But if somebody's studying you and, trying to figure you out so they can, manipulate you and all that stuff, it's like you have to not underestimate their ability to find those wounds, and they're gonna press on them,
Right. The other thing that's helped me with that is just to remember that there can be something to learn and an opportunity, even if some of what they say is nonsense and a lie. The part that is true, okay, maybe that's something for me to work on and try to improve upon that, so they can't use that against me anymore. And that's, I can disempower them that way.
Yes, I think that would be healthy, is to learn how to, because like you just said, you can disempower them, you can disarm them if that's something that you work on and is no longer like a button to push, right? It's not like a vulnerable spot anymore. So it's not even that you're validating that they're revealing something about you that's true, so much as it's like, okay, they've given me some information on how to disarm them a little bit more, so you kind of have to play their game.
Right, right. Now, another thing you mentioned in the book is that predators are not attracted to weakness. What
Mhm.
did you mean when you say that?
Yeah, so when I'm defining weakness in that context, in the sense of somebody who can't tolerate an emotional beating, like they don't have the resiliency, so they typically look for people who can take a long-term emotional beating. And I wouldn't consider those types of people weak, because they keep, even though it's not uh, helpful, they can keep coming back for more, keep giving them the benefit of the doubt, keep trying like a millionth time to see if this is going to be different this time. So, I mean, I don't think that makes somebody weak. Now, I would say that people can be in different periods of vulnerability when they're targeted, but vulnerability isn't weakness. I mean, everybody has vulnerabilities, right? So, um, yeah.
And that's one thing the predators can be pretty good at trying to find. They can really hone in on someone's vulnerabilities. And I know
Yeah.
Ted Bundy had said, for example, that he was able to spot a good victim just by the way they tilt their head or the way they walk down the street. I think they've even done a study with psychopaths, and they were able to pick out very accurately who would be a victim based on the gait of that person's walk. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
So when we're talking about psychopathy, something that you have to keep in mind is they have stress immunity. They have like low arousal. And so they probably are in touch with a reality that most people are not walking around in, because they're more neurotic and more, typically they get nervous with novel experiences, and nervous with, things that are supposed to startle us, that don't startle psychopaths. I think that because a psychopath is so, I think that they're aware that their operating system is drastically different, because they're not experiencing things the way other people keep repeating they're experiencing them. I think they can use that to their advantage to analyze like somebody's gait or the way they tilt their head. And I think some of that's probably embellished. Like they want you, they're so grandiose that they want you to believe they have some like superpower. But I do believe that there's some truth to it, in the sense that they stalk, they hunt, they look at people, they see which ones are probably a little bit in a vulnerable spot in that moment. But see, Ted Bundy was also kind of he talked about his ability to get people to do his bidding or do what he wanted with them as an art form and a skill. Like he was proud of the fact that he considered himself very skillful in that manipulative aspect. But he also didn't play fair. Like he would use props, he would feign injuries, he would sometimes wear uniforms. So he would do things that disarm people. Like, he's dressed up as a police officer, he's impersonating a police officer, he's wearing a sling, right? I need help lifting something in my car. Like, so if he was so skilled at identifying the ones who, would just do whatever he wanted, he probably wouldn't need those props. I think he's embellishing how great he was. I don't think he was a mastermind or like a genius the way a lot of people portray him. I think he was very skilled, but he also didn't have any arousal in the sense of fear, and he was pretty immune to stress and fear responses, so he could just kind of vet everybody and see who would take the bait.
Interesting. Now, I had heard also Jeffrey Dahmer.
Hmm.
People had said he had BPD, is what I have heard about him. Have you heard that?
I have.
And you think that's accurate with him?
I think the reason why people say that is because he did make statements about not wanting to be alone. And one of the reasons he disabled his victims is because he wanted to sleep with them, even post mortem, after he had killed them. And like there was something about him um, really having a problem with somebody leaving, right? And so when we see that, we talk about fears of abandonment, this rejection sensitivity. However, Jeffrey Dahmer's formal diagnosis is antisocial personality with psychopathic features. I mean, that's his on paper diagnosis. I think other people may have added borderline, but with with those individuals too, it depends on what the reason for the abandonment is. And what he really wanted to do is he wanted to control and dominate, which is more of a psychopathic realm of not wanting to be left. So he demanded that they stay, and he demanded that they stay. So he's going to do whatever it takes to make them stay. But he also wanted to dominate them. He didn't want to, I don't believe he wanted to merge with them. I could be wrong, but it doesn't seem like that, because he was comfortable with them no longer being conscious, and he just wanted the body. So that's not typically something that would satisfy a borderline personality. You know, they want the interaction and the merger. And oftentimes too, borderlines feel engulfed once they get what they want. They claim they really want to merge, but then once you're consistent with them, they push you away. He wasn't pushing anybody away. He was just killing them. So I feel like that's a little bit of a distinction with borderline. But again, these disorders overlap. So it's possible he had some of the internal conflict and neurotic traits of borderline. Another thing too is he was a very, very, very severe alcoholic, and alcoholism can mimic some personality disorder features. And one of the features that they've done studies on alcoholics almost like superficially meeting the criteria for borderline PD, and then after they're 3 to 6 months sober, all of those symptoms go away because they were symptoms of alcohol. They weren't features of BPD, but they can superficially look very similar. So maybe that was the BPD component, is that he was drinking a lot.
I mean, and that reminds me of the divorce lawyer, James Sexton. He had said, pictures don't tell the whole story. There's pictures of Jeffrey Dahmer smiling with people that he ate later. And I would say, yeah, that's pretty accurate. And I wouldn't be surprised if there might have been a comorbidity in there somewhere. That wouldn't surprise me at all.
No, but I think that he was definitely, the reason why the psychopathy makes more sense is his first kill, he got pulled over by the cops, and he was drunk. And he had the body parts in his back seat. And he was so cool and collected that they let him go on a warning. They said, all right, you're a young guy. I'm just going to let you go. There was another time when one of his victims escaped after he was abducted, and the police, he grabbed him and told the police, he's my friend. He's just really drunk. I just need to get him back to my apartment. People were there was witnesses saying, no, something's up here. Something's wrong. And the cops said, you're fine. So he also had that stress immunity that is definitely not indicative of BPD, because they panic. They're highly stressed. They have more neurotic traits, that negative affect and that mood instability. I mean, he got away with it so long because how he was very calculated and calm.
Right. And I guess with BPD also, there's the neurotic version. Then there's the more character disordered version of BPD too. And I guess it can go either way, I guess.
Yeah. But I mean, I wouldn't, if it's, I think if it fits, it fits. I mean, it's possible that if someone did an analysis and that, I'm sure there's other professionals who actually met him and could probably give more information, and, maybe they wrote about their experiences. But he definitely fits the bill for the antisocial with with psychopathic features, because I don't remember. I think he killed like 17 people.
Yeah, I'm not sure how many it was.
Yeah.
But here's another thing. I wasn't sure I was going to ask you this, but with autism and narcissism and borderline, one, do you ever see those overlap where someone is on the autistic spectrum and narcissistic spectrum? And do you ever see undiagnosed autism turn into a borderline? Is that even possible?
That's a fascinating question, because, and I'm gonna go into my clinical practice, because I've sat with thousands of people over the years, and what's really interesting is individuals who present with the criteria to meet BPD will often themselves say, I think I figured out what's going on. I think I'm on the spectrum. I looked it up. I fit all the criteria, and I think that I'm, autistic. So it's interesting. That's just an opinion. I'm not saying there's any validity to it, but what I'm saying is there is these superficially similar presentations of a lot of things, right? So we can say that some people with autism seem to have a lack of empathy, right? Is it the same lack of empathy as that's accompanied by that grandiosity where they have to be right because everyone else is wrong, end of story, they don't have to earn it? Or is it a misunderstanding, right? What's the etiology or the cause? Is it intentional, like I'm just not going to play fair, like end of story, which is narcissistic? Or is it more like, at this moment I can't see the big picture and I'm just going to be kind of like hitting the wall with this kind of rigidity that's neurodevelopmental but not necessarily personality related? So I think there's always these superficial overlaps in a lot of mental health conditions. I wouldn't say, though, that autism is related to narcissism or vice versa. And I wouldn't say that you asked if it could turn into it. My understanding of personality disorders is that they are enduring patterns of behavior. The onset is early in life, right? So there's a lot of things that are similar to autism. But I think, at least for now, there's a reason why they're classified differently. So I'm not sure if I do know that there's, the work of Robert Plomin. He wrote a really great book called Blueprint, and he actually talks about certain disorders almost kind of being able to morph into something different later on, from a behavioral genetic perspective, because there are more generalized categories of mental health and mental illness in that realm. So it's not like the diagnostic manual of all these different disorders and categories. It's more simplified. So, I mean, I'm probably not the expert to ask about autism. That's really outside of my scope. But I've just heard stories of people saying those types of things where they believe that they might be having that experience, and so who knows? But I think a lot of people too. I will say this, just to close that question off, or my answer to it anyway, is a lot of people have claimed to be on the spectrum who know they're not, and they're using it to justify their intentional manipulative behaviors. So narcissists, psychopaths, those types of people have used that as an excuse or a crutch for why they're doing what they're doing, and they know it's not true.
I mean, I could see that. Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, considering all of our talks about the genetic component and that versus the environmental component, do you think it's possible for a personality disorder to develop without that genetic predisposition? Can that be a thing?
Well, I guess anything's possible, but here's when I refer to genetic, I don't refer to environment means nothing and it's worthless and it's all nature. It's always nature and nurture. However, the way we've understood nurture more recently is different than how we traditionally understood it. So environment used to mean family upbringing and adversity. Now it means non-shared environmental experiences in the environment. So not the same upbringing as in siblings. This is why siblings are so drastically different than one another in temperament and personality. You can be under the same roof, go to the same school, have the same teachers, have the same peers, live in the same socioeconomic class, and be vastly different. And those differences are often attributed to differences in the DNA sequence. Like we have these differences that make us individuals, right? Then there's the non-shared environmental experiences, which refer to anything that's not where someone's grown up in the same like family environment. So two twins, for example, can have different experiences because one plays sports and the other is a musician. And so they're going to have these idiosyncratic differences in their environment that could influence how they are, right? But also what influences that is their genetic propensity. So I think it always has to be both and. And the way we define personality disorder is that the onset is very early. Again, I never want to go on the record and say that's impossible. But for the most part, we have to factor in our DNA, because that's how a lot of our DNA differences influence which environments we select and and
Right.
how we respond to them, and then how we perceive what happened to us. So, for example, a borderline personality will think that things that happen to them are the worst things that ever happened to anyone. And that's partly because of their genetic propensities. The way that they perceive things is disproportionate, oftentimes, from the reality of it. So it's blown out of proportion. And so they'll tell that story over and over and over again. This is the worst thing that happened. They might embellish and exaggerate it. A narcissist might minimize things. That's no big deal. I don't care. That was the past. Moving on. Stop being so sensitive. So they could be in the exact same environment or very similar to it and perceive it and respond to it completely differently. So maybe maybe there are cases where the environment was so influential that someone could be diagnosed with a personality disorder without having any influence, but also across the board, 50% of the differences in individuals is accounted for by differences in DNA. So I don't think we could ever really separate it completely.
It's like they say with eye color. Eye
Yeah.
color, what 90 something percent heritable is what eye color is. There
Yeah.
is no environmental influence there. And
Mhm.
I guess to summarize what you just said, you think that for the most part, it's not going to develop later in life, but it could be something maybe that could mimic some of the traits of a personality disorder, but it might not be the full blown disorder.
Yeah.
With okay,
Yeah. Presentations of it can look very superficially similar with traumatic brain injuries, with substance abuse, with brain tumors, with dementia. But if we look at the etiology of personality disorders, what we have to look for is a pervasive and enduring pattern that was early onset, right? So it can't really happen at 80 and call it narcissism, because in order for it to be considered a personality disorder, it has to have like this longitudinal, like sort of course across the lifespan. But somebody could get an illness or something later in life that could mimic a lot of the symptoms, the features, but those would be symptoms, not characteristics.
right. And then all the environmental people would say, well, anything that happens to you during childhood, that could all contribute to you developing a personality disorder. And that's of course what we talk about a lot is not completely being accurate.
Well, I would agree with it to an extent, because, but we have to separate causation from risk factor. And so one research article that I reference a lot, that's actually a meta-analysis. So it's not one research article. It's a summary of a bunch of research articles, right? It talks about how there's a high percentage of individuals who, with BPD, who don't report adversity in childhood. And so what's the cause of the presentation then? What's the cause of the disorder? Not all of them are self-reporting that they've had the worst childhoods, or they've had sexual abuse, or they've had trauma. A lot of them are not a large percentage of them are not reporting that. So we have to consider that there's another cause to that if some of them don't have the history and don't even claim to have the history.
Right. And that's the part that would drive them up the wall, the environmental people, because they wouldn't know what to do with that.
Right. But I mean, and I don't know that how common that's not common knowledge, because this is research that's written by people who have clinical practices or have opened clinics dedicated to the treatment of BPD. So they're seeing, large percentages of these individuals in clinical populations, and it's not common knowledge. But, that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Just because we've typically heard over and over again, you weren't born this way, something had to have happened to you to make you this way. There are lots of exceptions to that. And so we don't need to throw out the environmental influence, but we need to add the large component of the heritability, which I think a lot of people, don't really like to go into. I think also that term just doesn't, a lot of people don't understand quite what it means. Like, heritability and genetic doesn't mean deterministic. It means that this is what is, doesn't mean what could potentially be. It's not a static blueprint, right? I mean, it's for the most part pretty rigid. Like our personalities are the most like inflexible, aspect of psychology across our lifespan. But it doesn't mean don't try to change or don't. It just means maybe some new interventions down the road are actually going to be more successful than the trauma stuff, because it doesn't work on narcissists. It just doesn't. They don't get better.
And that's the other thing I hear about the genetic component is people will claim, oh, you're letting them off the hook, or you're
No,
giving them a free pass because there's a genetic component.
no. I mean, I think it's more of a free pass to say that your mommy and daddy did this to you.
Aha.
Because then because they can talk about that. They can talk about their childhood in therapy for 30 years and nothing changes. And they're going to continue getting validated. It's like, that doesn't help them. What they need is, you need to install the pieces that are missing in them. Right. So it's more of an installation process and a modification of behavior process. It's not healing the wounds, because those wounds really don't, once they're healed, they don't take the narcissism out of people. They just don't. So the whole genetic, this idea that it lets them off the hook because it's not their fault. Well, so let's say it's nobody's fault what genome or genotype they get. It is our responsibility to do something about it if it's interfering with the lives of other people, right? Like, that's just how life goes. There's people who don't have personality disorders who have a lot of difficulties, and they have to overcome those difficulties in order to live their best life. It's just, everybody is responsible for their character, regardless of what causes it.
Absolutely. Now, do you think there's any kind of spiritual component to narcissism? I see people throw around in my comment sections all the time, demonic forces, spiritual warfare. What do you think about that?
I mean, like the cop-out answer is like, that answer is above my pay grade. I don't, but I will say, historically, what has been described as demonic and diabolical is very much in line with the features of what we refer to as psychopathy, and even some of the malignant narcissism. So I definitely, I don't have the ability to say completely like no. That's typically not where I lean, but at the same time, I'm open to that. There's a lot of people who talk about, like, if you're preyed upon more if you're vulnerable or traumatized or things like that. And there've been a lot of examples of how that's also how people become possessed, right? There's like there's something in there that there's this darkness that can kind of penetrate that more when you're in that vulnerable state. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's certainly worth exploring. I have a lot of people who write about that on my Instagram reels and stuff. They'll say, this is the Jezebel spirit, or this is demonic, or, this is something, this is an entity, right? And I think that there was probably a time where nobody had any other explanation but that. And maybe we can bridge the gap on, what that means, philosophically, spiritually, scientifically. I don't really have like a desire to disprove that, I'm not like trying to say that's a bunch of nonsense, I'm not that, it's not, but I do think that there's this interesting television series called Evil. And I think like there's a perspective of the scientific cause, and then there's the spiritual cause, and they end up in the same place. Like what caused this? Was this a demon? Was this evil? Or was this absence, these deficits that this person just doesn't have, and they don't seem human? The outcome is the same. It's just like, I guess you get to choose which ideology you support, right?
Right. I mean, I could see that too. I think with Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and whatever ancient cultures were out there, what they described as demons, it sure does sound a lot like a narcissist and psychopath behavior It sure does sound like it. And I think they just didn't have the terminology, maybe, but that's really what they meant. I totally think that could be possible.
I certainly think they were onto something. I mean, and it's possible that they didn't have the language, or the understanding to call it something different. So they used a lot of metaphor and stuff like that. I will say though that like character disorders have been written about for thousands and thousands of years, and very impressively similar to what we call personality disorders today. And they weren't referring to these individuals as having been wounded or traumatized. They were just saying this person is the way they are everywhere, and it's problematic, and we're calling them this. There's the vicious man, there's the, whatever. And they weren't trying to figure out, like, it just was understood that people are like this. 2,000-3,000 years ago, there's documented writings about these character disorders. So I don't know. And then other people have this idea that this is diabolical, evil personified. I mean, there's certainly a lot of absence in them that we typically, what we consider and have collectively accepted as human and humane, is absent in a lot of psychopaths. So,
It reminds me of what Father Marin said in The Exorcist when he was trying to tell the other priest how to deal with the demon. He said, the demon's going to lie, and they're going to psychologically attack you by mixing lies with the truth. So do not listen. And I would say, hey, where is the lie there? If you're dealing with a narcissistic person, that's exactly what you would do to deal with them too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not ruling it out. I'm not ruling out a spiritual component or a demonic component, but I'm definitely not all in on it either.
I can't remember the name of the movie. I think it's called The Last Exorcist. It's whichever one Russell Crowe plays. I think it's Gabriel Amorth, like an exorcist, a priest who's an exorcist. But he kind of says in the film, majority of the calls I go on are psychologically related. And so it's interesting because he's like, we have to rule that out before we, make any claim that there's a demon involved here. And then there's, on a rare occasion, there's these other examples that just don't seem to be related to psychology. There's like just something else there. And so, but I thought that was kind of interesting. It's like, in order for an exorcism to be granted, right, there needs to be a psychological evaluation. So I think there's, it's interesting to see those two worlds kind of collide and overlap.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. To circle back to your book, though,
Yeah.
You had mentioned in the book things to focus on and things to not focus on. Could you go over that?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about trauma bonds specifically, there is this understanding that there's interventions that are very helpful when you're not being manipulated, that sometimes get thrust onto clients or individuals who are trying to recover from a trauma bond. And it puts all of the responsibility on them to like look inward and try to figure out how they got themselves into this. So codependency, attachment, insecurity, not setting appropriate boundaries, that type of stuff, or the things that I say you really shouldn't focus on when you're trying to recover from a trauma bond, because it's assuming that you came into this relationship with all of these problems, and those problems are sustaining the relational dynamics and conflict. Whereas there are some times, a lot of the time, when somebody intentionally sought you out to exploit you, your attachment style and this idea of codependency and boundary setting, no matter how much you work on them, they're going to be violated anyway. So they don't really, it's not something that you should put on yourself as something that could be an agent of change in the relationship. Because if you get a secure attachment and you set very firm boundaries and, you stop being codependent, that person's still going to exploit you and manipulate you. There's nothing you can do to stop being manipulated by someone who's a manipulator. So I say don't focus on those things in the context of a trauma bond, because working on them isn't going to help you get out of that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what are some painful questions that people should be asking themselves?
I mean, painful questions, I'm kind of referring to like a lot of it is accepting the reality of what this has been. I think a lot of people don't want to get a divorce. A lot of people don't want to feel like they have to protect their kids from their spouse. A lot of people don't want their kids to be from a broken home. I mean, those are just some of the more obvious examples. Not everybody has children or is married, but those are really difficult life transitions, and people are going to do whatever it takes to hold on to not having to go through that. And that rightfully, I mean, it's torture to have to, even people who are cohabitating and one person has to move out, I mean, these are painful experiences to go through. So those are some of the painful questions you need to ask, right? Like kind of like reality testing, reality check questions. Like, is this something that I need to just jump off the cliff rather than waiting for, somebody to, give me you know, a life preserver or whatever. Like, it's just, these are harsh realities that need to be faced head on. And so those types of questions I think need to be asked, related to the relationship that you're in. If you're stuck and you're being manipulated.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think another thing people would like to hear is that you said songs with revenge lyrics can actually be very good for your healing.
Yeah. I mean, I think when we're talking about self-care, in the book, I reference a lot of individuals who have that chronic freeze response. So they're frozen, they're immobilized, or they're fawning, they're accommodating, and they're stuck in that loop. And so a lot of people are given advice to do some like meditation or mindfulness, and I don't think that helps get you out of a freeze response. So I've just used some examples of getting things moving more. So dancing, listening to music, using your body to kind of feel like get less immobilized. And the reason I use the example of revenge lyrics is because you can fantasize. I mean, we have like a lot of people describe revenge fantasies, and I think it's healthier to fantasize about retaliation rather than in developing sort of like an internal justice. But you kind of can live vicariously through the lyrics, or it can empower you. Certain songs, where instead of trying to confront the person or getting yourself in any sort of legal trouble by retaliating. So it's just another way to kind of use your imagination to feel kind of satisfied in a revenge setting that's not harmful to anyone.
So you're saying to the ladies to listen to Carrie Underwood's Before He Cheats, and that should be like on repeat?
What's funny is the song that comes to mind when I think about that is a Nine Inch Nails song, and the lyrics are, "I'd rather die than give you control, and no, you can't take that away from me." So it's like
What song is that?
it's called "Head Like a Hole." I think is the one
I
that
know that
put
song.
them on the map, like in the '80s. A lot of those grunge bands were really dark, and so there's a lot of revenge lyrics in that, in the sense of the struggle for control and weak and strong and stuff like that. Some of them are depressing, but some of them are kind of empowering.
No, that makes sense. I don't remember hearing those lyrics in that song, but next time I listen to it, I'll have to keep my ears open for it.
Yeah.
Now, another concept you mentioned in the book, the false mirror. And I actually think this can help people heal too. But what is the false mirror?
What context did I use it in? Because that term
About
gets.
the love bombing. So when someone's love bombing, there's a false mirror in that you are seeing reflected back to you parts of yourself that you really like.
Oh, yeah. The mirror, yeah, the mimicking and mirroring. Yes. We typically, so this is some research on empathy has shown that we typically empathize the most with people who have gone through similar things as us and are similar to us in certain ways. And so individuals who are manipulative will oftentimes study you, and they'll ask probing questions so that they get your history, and then they will fabricate a history and reflect it back to you. And the reason they do that is because they're holding up a false mirror, in the sense of they're really giving you information about yourself, but saying that it happened to them. And that disarms you immediately and evokes empathy. So you tell them that you've had a hard childhood, they'll say, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe this. I went through the same thing. Or if you say, I've been cheated on, they'll say, I know, I was cheated on too. I could never cheat on anybody because I know how that feels. And so they're using that and they're holding up a mirror. It's a false mirror. But what they're really trying to do is disarm you enough to gain trust. You let your guard down, you get hooked. And then at that point, the intermittent reinforcement is only a matter of time, and you're biochemically hijacked. Essentially, you're hooked in a very dependent way, which is not codependency.
Right.
It's just that you were manipulated enough to let your guard down, and the trust for you is real. The bond for you is real. For them, it's not real, and so they can walk away from it. They're the puppet master essentially, and all of this was because they used your good aspects against you, and held up a mirror that actually resembled you, but found a way to convince you that it was really, you guys were like kindred spirits or soulmates because you have so much in common. And they do that very often, and they know how to manipulate that in an opportunistic way, and even a preferential way, meaning they're people who are kind of almost stalking you. They do that, and then people who just stumble upon you, they're very good at figuring out how to do that to you.
Right. And to me, that's part of the silver lining too, that you're falling in love with parts of yourself. You're falling in love with who you are, just simply being reflected back to you. Your likes and your dislikes, and them quote unquote empathizing with your experiences. You're really empathizing with yourself. And I think that's one thing that can help people moving forward.
Yeah, because I mean, that promotes this idea of compatibility. Because you know who you are, and hopefully you like who you are, and you like your interests, and so if they use that against you, like, oh my gosh, we have so much in common. I mean, that's what people love to hear, because then they know that they don't have to modify their lives, they adjust things too much, they're accepted for who they are. It seems like it's an easy fit, it's just the missing puzzle piece. But these people, they're lying to you. So none of it's true. Their histories aren't true. Their interest in music might not even be true. I mean, they do all kinds of things to make you feel like you've met someone who nothing's going to have to shift drastically, and it's all a facade.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, and last time we had spoken about toxic masculinity, and you had said that you were going to do a workshop on that.
Mm-hmm.
What did you have to say about toxic masculinity?
Yeah, it's certainly toxic. I have this, a lot of those traits or those tendencies or those ideologies that are kind of really extreme, that are radical, are very similar to a lot of traits that we find in personality disorders. So I'm not saying that everybody who subscribes to that is disordered, but what I'm saying is a lot of people who are disordered create that type of material, and then impressionable people, especially younger people, are looking for a way to make sense of things, and they can gravitate towards that and really cling to it, and it can become very dangerous for them.
Right. And I think right now, toxic masculinity to me is more about just toxic traits in general, regardless of masculinity. That's how I would see it. It's just a person who is a guy who is being toxic. And they'll call it toxic masculinity, but it is what it is. And I think, not to be too controversial about this, but I see people, they don't really care about toxic masculinity when it's something they agree with. For example, when I see people like Luigi, and I see women, mind you, commenting about how he killed the CEO of the insurance company.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of these women just love him. I was like, oh, would you call a murderer someone that's displaying toxic masculinity? Probably, I guess, right? That's probably not so good. But so many people I'm seeing saying things like, oh, he's amazing. He needs to be freed. I would let him do anything he wants to me. And I'm thinking to myself, if this isn't proven that they don't really, like, toxic masculinity isn't the problem, it's just that when they don't agree with how you're using it, that's more of the problem.
Yeah, I think we have to be clear on what it means too, like what it's referring to specifically. I think it can be very generalized, you know. I know that if we're looking at it from the perspective of, okay, there's these natural tendencies that are masculine. I think the masculinity aspect gets distorted and perverted a lot when we're referring to toxic masculinity, as if that's what masculinity is, but that's not what it is. That's what people are trying to convince you it is. And I see your point about some individuals would consider that toxic masculinity according to like definition and descriptive terms, but then then they'll make exceptions in that way, and so that's kind of interesting, actually, what you brought up.
Well, I mean, that gets into political stuff too as well. They agree with the cause of there should be a socialized medicine. There should be healthcare for everyone. So they think he's justified in doing what he did because there's a lot of people that insurance company denied. They denied healthcare coverage for. And I'm not saying whether I'm for or against or whatever, but that's just what they say.
I mean, yeah, that is definitely more political. But again, you're describing this dichotomous all or nothing thinking, this radical thinking. I know, you know, individuals who claim to be extremely pro-life have blown up abortion clinics. So they've committed murder, but they're not killing babies; they're killing adults. So it's somehow okay, because those people were going to kill babies. So I have the right to kill them. That's not even what I just said is not a political statement in any way, shape, or form, but it's this tendency to take something to the extreme for a cause, while there's also a lot of contradictions and hypocrisy there.
Double standards, hypocrisy, you name it.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that everyone does, or in the political world, at least. In the political world, it seems to me they all have their own versions of double standards. Personally, I'm more of a moderate type person. Mm-hmm. So I think I'm uniquely qualified because I've done many years of political polling in places like Pennsylvania. I can call out all the sides BS, and I see plenty of BS on everywhere.
We live in a very polarized world in the macro sense. What's interesting is, like, I get a lot of people giving me a hard time about things I say. No, you're wrong. It's this, right? Like in social media. But if you're having just like one-on-one conversation, and I talk to people the way I'm talking to you, it's like, okay, I can see that. I don't fully agree with it, but maybe you can help me understand where you got that information. There's much more of a collaborative component. But I think when something's put out, it's almost like it's immediately put into one category or another. Like it's dichotomized instead of it being like a discussion point, like a talking point. I love it when people say, you know, you posted this thing. I never heard it from that perspective. I've always heard it this way. I've had this personal experience. I'm curious how you can help me identify the distinctions. That's like a wonderful thing, because they're not insulting or demeaning, and they're just like curious, like, I'm confused by what you said. I need you to help me clarify. That's very nice. And then you get the people that are like, no, you're wrong. I don't care how many credentials you have or how many people you work with, or, you know, what research you can point me to. It's irrelevant to the fact that my opinion supports my reality and you're wrong. And it's like that polarization is just not helpful. It's not helpful in the toxic masculinity conversation, and it's not helpful in the pro-life, pro-choice. It's not helpful in anything that you could say is political. It's just really not helpful, you know?
Those collaborative discussions, they're pretty hard to come by in the political world. Now, one-on-one, I think they are more possible, but online, they are extremely rare. And what made me think of the toxic masculinity thing anyway was the Netflix show Adolescence, and how they're talking about, I guess, young boys' problems with the incel ideology. And to me personally, that was always a different thing than involuntary celibate. That's how I had always thought of the word incel. But apparently now the definition has morphed into the misogynistic ideology version of incel. So you can't even say that word without people saying, oh, you must be misogynistic and you must be worshiping Andrew Tate, etc.
Yes, this idea that lack of success with women or sexual success is women's fault, and you hate women if you're not, you know, I mean, I think a lot of people probably are looking for a reason to justify why they're not, happy with relationships. I don't, as far as this terminology and stuff, I mean, I think what's really important is trying our best not to stay in the all or nothing thinking. Just trying to find a way to stay in the middle. Like, let's just hear each other out. I actually had a conversation with somebody, an interview recently with somebody about that. The third episode of that series, where he's talking to the psychologist, and
Right.
But I mean, these are important things to discuss. Maybe we can discuss them again in more depth on another time. I think it's important. I think it's important to also have discussions where nobody's getting activated or triggered, and we're just kind of trying to figure stuff out so people we can
You ask a lot. You're asking a lot.
Yeah, but I don't want, if anyone ever, I mean, this is like the fourth time you've had me on, and I appreciate that, but I think people should want to ask questions about these conversations rather than condemn them, or just, try to flat out say you're wrong, you're insane, you don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand why that's I shouldn't say that. I do understand why that's so common, but I think no one's trying to convince anyone of anything. We're just trying to, bridge gaps here, I think, is what we're trying to do.
Well, I think that's the problem, is that is not what everyone's trying to do. There is tripwires everywhere with that incel conversation. And I've fallen into a bunch of them just by making that clarification about, I'd always thought an incel was just someone who was unsuccessful in dating. I didn't always apply it to that misogynistic ideology. But the very fact I said that, people they were very upset with me, because I just didn't go with, yep, they were misogynistic. Anyone who says that must be misogynistic and feels like they're entitled to sex. And I would say, well, sometimes there are sometimes like that. I just don't know if every person who is involuntarily celibate is like that.
This reminds me of like those semantic arguments people get into, where like they're defining a term as it is like in the last like 2 weeks, as opposed to like what the terms have meant historically. Right. If you're talking to me about involuntary and celibacy, that existed before this red pill, whatever nonsense, like this like extreme radical misogynistic ideology. They're not that origin of those terms didn't start in the toxic masculinity realm. There probably have been people who would identify as that because they were wanting, a girlfriend or wanting a boyfriend, and then they weren't getting one. And that's just, I mean, that has nothing to do with anything political and anything other than that. So I get what you're saying. I think the words mean something, and then over time it becomes a term. And then that term can only mean one thing. And if you say anything different about it, then people are going to get pissed off. And actually, that's also the case with narcissism and BPD. I just posted about, there are different presentations of BPD, and some of them are pretty cruel and severe. And I got people, messaging me immediately, "You're wrong. I have BPD. I'm not like that." I said, there are variations. You didn't listen to the video, because I said there are variations, and I'm going to speak about this one today. And then maybe tomorrow I'll speak about the one that you present with. But they can't hear that. It's just, you're wrong, I'm right, end of story. And that's what you're describing, essentially. We're not even talking about the word. We're talking about how people get so vehemently opposed to you having an opinion about the word.
Yeah, there's those tripwires. Yeah. And the tripwires often involve misogyny or racism or sexism or fill in the blank with whatever thing. But those are the tripwires. Yeah. And I think there definitely is an interesting discussion to be had about relationships and also borderline too. We haven't really talked too much about that, but there's other concepts in regards to borderline. There's a book I really enjoyed about it. It talks about the 4 kinds. Now, there's no scientific data with that, but there's the waif, the BPD queen, the hermit, and the witch. I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah.
Christine Ann Lawson, I think, wrote it.
So that's, that's descriptive. And I think that it doesn't necessarily have to be in a diagnostic manual for it to be valid. I think that, people are coming up with subtypes, and they're coming up with different ways of describing the presentation, that's because they've seen it in that way, and it doesn't exactly fit with that checklist. So I think that can be very useful. So we can talk about that another time maybe too.
Absolutely. Well, any other closing thoughts you have for us here?
I think that's pretty much it. I think we covered it.
So traumatic cognitive dissonance, everyone should check that out. Check out Dr. Peter Salerno on Instagram and YouTube too.
Yeah, I'm going to start finally putting some stuff on YouTube. So I have a channel. I just don't have a lot posted on it. So
we'll make sure we'll include those links in the description. Thank you very much for joining us again today, Dr. Salerno. Always appreciate it.
Yep. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
You got it. Have a good one.